Hey, Dad, welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast. And as Lawson and I do occasionally, and frankly, over the next month or so, as we're going to give you several opportunities, we love to let you learn from other men around the world. And our guest today is a guy named John Coleman. Can't wait to tell you more about him and let him introduce himself to you. But today we're going to talk about money. Now, I know for some of you that strikes panic in your heart. All the more reason to stay tuned in, because John's going to relieve us of all the panic, he said. No, he didn't say that. I said that. Before we dive in, let's remember two things, please. One, today's show is brought to you by Range Leather. We love the guys at Range Leather. They do an amazing job. In fact, they make really cool leather wallets in which you can put your money. As you can see, I'm the master of the segue to our sponsor.
So good.
Go to rangeleather.com. Go to rangeleather.com and use the code MJ15 to get 15% off your next order. Save some money. John's going to talk about that. And when you have extra money every month, feel free to give us some of it at manhoodjourney.org. Go to manhoodjourney.org/guard, GUARD, and join our team of monthly supporters, Lawson. Any minute now, we're going to hit our 100th monthly supporter. Super excited.
We were there, but hey, we're close.
We're getting there. We were introduced to our guest today about a month or month and a half ago through a mutual friend. And John Coleman is an investor. He's an author, a speaker, and his work explores the intersection of faith, purpose, and finance. He serves as co-CEO of Sovereign's Capital, a values-driven investment firm that's active in public equities, private equity, and venture capital. And he's a co-founder of the faith-driven investor movement. John, welcome to today's show, my friend.
Yeah, Lawson, Ken, thanks for having me on, guys. This will be a lot of fun. And good money is the type of money you keep in a Range Leather wallet. So I'm glad we were able to.
Right.
There we go. Already
Good
John's
work.
on the Range Leather bandwagon.
Yeah, I like
Attaboy. Attaboy. The title of the book, John, is Good Money, 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. And that's going to be the backdrop of our conversation today in a moment. But before we get to the book and all the cool things inside it, tell us a little bit about your story and your family.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually born in Gainesville, Florida. When I was born, my dad was a rodeo cowboy. So he rode bulls and saddle horses. And yeah, if you want to talk about disappointing your father on the toughness spectrum, I have been a perpetual disappointment to my own father. It's pretty hard to live up to those expectations. But he was in college and rodeo, and my mom cut hair. We lived in a little single wide trailer when I was born. Fast forward 10 years later, I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, where I know Lawson has some connections. And he had become a financial advisor, actually. So I got a little more accustomed to the idea of money. I grew up in Columbus, had a lot of fun as a kid, had two little brothers. So I was the oldest. And then went away to a college called Berry College in Northwest Georgia, kind of a small school there, and embarked on a career where I really didn't know what I was going to do. Thought I'd be a journalist or an academic after school, decided that I might want to pursue this business thing and see what that was about. Randomly got a job at a quantitative energy hedge fund. First job out of school, was the world's worst quantitative energy trader for a little while. Went to a consulting firm called McKinsey & Company, which was a lot more aligned with kind of what I was interested in. Went away to grad school and actually got married. Started dating my wife just before graduate school, got married during graduate school. We spent about 5 years married before we had kids. So we moved back to Atlanta at some point. I migrated from consulting back into the investment world with a big firm in Atlanta. And then we embarked on having our own kids. So we had 4 kids over the space of about a decade there. Today, those kids are 5 to 12 in age, 2 boys, 2 girls. We live in Atlanta today. And as you mentioned, I left my big firm about 5 years ago to join a smaller faith-driven investment firm called Sovereign's Capital, which kind of includes the values of our Christian faith and everything that we do, whether it's entertainment or private equity or venture capital, which we could talk about a bit more. And that's been an awesome journey, being a part of a startup, almost a startup. It was a small firm when I joined. We've had the opportunity to grow, really an opportunity to fully integrate my faith into the work that I do and be one person inside and outside work. And then all along the way, I've continued to be a writer as kind of a side gig. So published 3 books now with Harvard Business Review and 2 in other forums. And mostly for Harvard Business Review these days, I write on the topics of purpose, human flourishing, meaning, and leadership. So my last book was the HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose, the little red books you see in airports from HBR. And then the new book is Good Money. As I was starting to think about this world I live in professionally of money, and the idea that I want people to build a relationship with money that leads to human flourishing rather than being destructive, I thought it would be great to write a book about that because I'd never
Mm.
seen on that topic before. So this is HBR's first personal finance book. It's less kind of Dave Ramsey style practical tips, although there are some of those, and more about kind of habits, mindsets, and values. So that's kind of where we stand today.
Wow, man. What a you summarized that so well. You didn't even stutter
Yeah, that
one
was
time.
awesome.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Will you take a moment and just kind of ground us? I've heard you talk about now in the book, human flourishing. Will you just expand on where you're coming from? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, from a Christian perspective, I think at the very top, we all think of our lives aligned with the teachings of Jesus and following Jesus as the route to flourishing as an individual, becoming more like Jesus. In the practical realities of day to day life, that translates into a series of intrinsically good things that we try and build into our lives that help you lead not just a happy life, but kind of a joyful and fulfilled life. Those are intuitive to a lot of Christians, although many of us have not mapped those out explicitly or have not thought
Mm.
about them in practical terms. I actually, in the book, because it's for a mainstream audience and it's a lot of my research, have pivoted off a couple of different frameworks. One from a guy named Marty Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, another called Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard University, who I've gotten to know a bit. And there's really a research basis for what are those things that allow people to live happy, fulfilled, purposeful lives. And those are what we call intrinsically good things. They're good for their own pursuit, not just a means to something else. Things like character and virtue, positive depth and breadth of your positive social relationships, meaningful and purposeful work, impact on others, generosity, happiness, physical, mental, and spiritual health, et cetera. And so there's kind of a list of 5 or 6 things that I go through in the book. And those are the things that, if you just thought about them comprehensively, compose really a holistic life. And what's interesting to me from that is that money is not among those intrinsically good things. The Harvard
Mm.
program actually lists financial and material stability as one of its keys to flourishing, but it's different than the other 5 characteristics in the sense that it's the only one that's a means, not an ends. You don't pursue money for itself. You
Yeah.
just need enough financial and material stability so that you can pursue those more meaningful things in life. And that's actually one of the core concepts in the book is to remember that money itself is not a goal. Money is simply a tool that you use to achieve greater things in life, more important, more meaningful things, which I think is echoed in the scriptures as well.
Mm. You said something interesting as you were describing your transition, John, from big companies, some of which the names are kind of household names, McKinsey and others. When you went to the smaller firm, you said something I just want to touch on very quickly, or as long as you like. You said something about now you could live kind of one life, uh, be one person inside and outside of work. Tell me more about what you meant by that.
Well, I think a lot of us put on kind of different hats when we go home and when we go to work. Outside of work, hopefully, you're living in a way that's deeply aligned with your core values. You're living into your family. You practice your faith. When you get to work, you often make yourself almost a different person, not in the sense that you're trying to hide those things, but in a
Mm.
professional environment, you obviously can't engage with your colleagues quite as fluidly about your most deeply held values, at least in
Mm.
most places. And especially having grown up in the big corporate world, I always was very, no one, it wasn't a secret that I was a person of faith, for example. I shared about my family quite a lot, but
Yeah.
I wasn't doing my work day to day in a way that was deeply aligned with my most core interests, my faith, my values.
Yeah. Yeah.
Joining Sovereigns was awesome because it's a firm that's explicitly Christian in nature. We do faith driven investing. And so, what I think about with regards to human flourishing, with regards to the tenets of my faith, I get to now live out in the day to day practice of my work, however imperfectly. I get to embed that in what I'm doing day to day. And that's just
Mm.
been refreshing because I think a lot of us really segregate those two worlds. And maybe we have even more worlds than that. But this opportunity to live integrated, I think, has been a wake up call for me just about how fulfilling that kind of integration can be.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because we see this. Even Lifeway did a study years ago about why kids tend to abandon their faith. And one of the things they cite is the hypocrisy of their parents. Like, it's okay for us to be imperfect. We just can't be complete abject hypocrites, right? It can't be like I'm one kind of guy on a Sunday and I'm a whole different guy Monday through Saturday. And so that overlap, that integration of kind of who we are, in one context versus another, hopefully those things are eclipsing as they go, and we're really just one person.
Well, and giving your kids visibility into that, I think, is important. One of the practices I've started taking up, at least for the older kids, is bringing my oldest son along on work trips. He tends to want to go on the more fun work trips, not the more boring work
Of
trips I've
course.
noticed, but
Smart man.
I think it's fun to kind of bring him along, let him see what day-to-day life is like. We talk about, and we can get into this further, but as I've thought about this topic of financial apprenticeship more, we're exposing even the very young kids to more around savings and investing and giving
Mhm.
together as a family. And a lot of I think, the hypocrisy thing, sometimes it's true. Sometimes we live in a way that is hypocritical. A lot of times it's because kids just don't have real visibility into the complexity of adult life. We kind of shield them from that. And so they see
So true.
glimpses of it. Here's hypocritical. And then, sometimes it's just being a kid. Like I tell people all the time, uh, one of the things for me as I've gotten older is just how much less hypocritical I think everyone else is because you go through your own peaks and valleys
Right, sure.
and you develop a lot more of a sense of grace for others having
Yeah.
experienced difficulty.
Yeah.
And I think that's just part of the maturation process. Like everybody is least hypocritical when they're 16 years old and they haven't had a chance to be very hypocritical yet. Um, and by the time you're in your 40s, you're like, goodness gracious, there, but grace of God go I. So you extend a bit more grace to others, I
Yeah,
think.
I keep telling Lawson to take it easy on me, but he just keeps raking me over the coals for being a hypocrite. I'm like, bro,
I
grow up.
I heard a guy say his hypocrisy does have bounds. Um,
That's great. That's a good
so,
line.
hey, John, in the book, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. I'll summarize or paraphrase, but I found it really kind of interesting, and I wondered if it was how in your research have you come upon this? Said 88% of parents say that it's extremely or very important for their children to have financial independence and maybe, careers or jobs that are more prosperous than their own. And I understand that inherently as a dad. I want my kids to go on and do better, be better, learn more quickly and easier than I did. But if we're not careful, I wonder what you have found and what your thoughts are on that can become sort of a dominant
Mm,
driving force, and men are susceptible to of doing too much, working too long, prioritizing that paycheck and that opportunity, knowing obviously that there are some necessities, there are some cases where, guys are like I gotta have 2 jobs right now, and I'm not gonna see my kids, but it's a hopefully for them, it's a season versus becoming this American, dominate, drive, 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 so that my kids are set up and have more.
yeah.
But what they're doing is they're trading that off for quality time with their kids. Talk about what you found and what's in the book.
Yeah, gosh, so much to unpack there. Maybe I'll start with the kind of adult behavior and then how that filters to the kids. You're right. The dominant goal that people have for their kids is financial security, even more so than like families, meaningful work, et cetera, which I think is a misprioritization. And I'll come back to that a bit. And it can become a goal at the expense of other things. And often in our lives, particularly as dads or men, although I think it's true of men and women to some extent, we lose sight of the why of money. We start to treat money itself as the end instead of thinking about what are we trying to earn for and when will we lean into those things that are more important? At what level can we? Part of the research on this is the idea that if you ask people how much is enough for them to be happy and fulfilled, the answer is always a little bit more.
Mhm.
Um, a Harris poll came out recently of several thousand people where they asked people at different median income brackets how much would be enough for you to be happy and fulfilled. And the funny thing was at, $35, $40,000, that's $60,000. At
Yeah.
$100,000, that's 150. At 250, that's 350. We're all wired with something in psychology called hedonic adaptation, which is once we achieve a lifestyle, once we acquire a thing, we quickly set that as our new baseline and want more and more and more and just escalate the desires that we have without regard for the why. Are these things intrinsically meaningful or fulfilling? Are they causing us to be distracted from meaningful relationships from our kids, from building relationships with friends, from developing character and virtue, from meaningful work, etc.? And so we start to treat this thing that should be an enabler as a
Yeah.
finish line, and it's a finish line that's always out of reach. They also call it the hedonic treadmill, which is this idea that you're running a race you can never win because it never has an end. One of the principles I encourage people to adopt as a result in the book is this concept of a financial finish line, which is you sitting down with your spouse and saying, what does a comfortable life look like for us? And preferably doing this early. And then instead of chasing an escalating lifestyle beyond that, to be comfortable with that and use any additional resources you have beyond that for more meaningful things, for charitable giving, investment in a business, the ability to scale back work,
Yeah.
do something more impactful. Because if you don't set that finish line, if you don't establish, like, what is my lifestyle, the vast majority of people simply escalate their lifestyle to match their income and live in this constant cycle of chasing something that's totally out of reach. And I think that example then filters to kids, particularly when we prioritize money over almost anything else as an outcome for the lives of our.
Mm. Mm. So a follow-up to that, and, I love the good money mindset, sort of this faith-driven investment, and not necessarily an investment in like a stock or, some sort of fund or something like that, or a company. Investment in our family as a dad. And we have dads with young kids like you. I mean, you guys are busy 5 to 12. Whew. But also, grandfathers that are maybe moving in or already into their season of retirement. But the what I've heard you talk about is obviously money being a means, not an end, but that mindset of what to do with that tool called money. Earn
Yeah.
it, spend it, invest it, and give it. Those 4 things. How do you relate that to this faith-driven investment, that good money mindset?
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned in the book, we outline basically the 4 primary ways in which you encounter money: bringing it in by earning it, sending it out by spending it and giving it. And then there's investing, which kind of sends it out and brings it in, hopefully, if you do a good job. And in each of those categories, that fundamental framework on flourishing is intended to connect with each of those categories to guide your behaviors, right? And it looks different by each one. When I start, the earning one is often overlooked, but I think important. If you do global surveys now, somewhere between 15 and 20% of people say that they're engaged at work. In no country in the world do a majority of people say
Yeah.
that they get a meaningful sense of purpose at work. There's an epidemic now of people who are dissatisfied at work, feeling like they're not having an impact, not feeling engaged. They're just doing it for a paycheck. And that's the concept I really focus in on earning, which is, hey, if you're going to spend a plurality of your life, 40, 50, 60 hours a week doing this thing, it's a shame if you're doing that without a sense of purpose,
Mm.
without the tools for flourishing, like cultivating positive relationships, refining a craft, living with character and virtue at work. And it's also a shame connecting to kids if you're not giving your kids exposure to that concept so that they can do the same thing. Often kids start to learn from their parents implicitly or explicitly. Work is a thing I do for a paycheck, not a meaningful thing in my life. And
Mm.
that's a terrible way
Mm.
to spend life. I
That's
think
tough.
they're
Yeah.
Right.
success without significance. Like, I want my kids to learn you can do a job, and not every job is easy. Sometimes you're living hand to mouth and jobs are really hard, and not every part of every job is fun. I have parts of my job that aren't fun or aren't terribly purposeful. We all do a little paperwork, but I want them to know, like, your profession should actually be a core source of purpose, meaning, and flourishing in your
Mm.
life. And if it's just to get a paycheck, you're losing a huge
Right.
opportunity. And I think that very much aligns with the
Yeah.
scriptures.
Well,
Um, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Keep going.
I've got a follow-up on that too, but I don't wanna interrupt your thought.
No, go ahead.
So the practical, like, there are I think people listening to the podcast going, "Yep, right in line, love it. I'm on. I feel okay, good. I feel like I'm on track." Others are like, "That's easy for you to say. You've got it figured out," or like I'm in this tough position. And maybe maybe, and I think it's in a lot of cases legit. It's just sometimes you go through these times in life where it's like I don't have a choice. I got to do this job and my part time thing, and I just got to slug. And I want to find purpose and meaning, but right now I've just got to do the work, and I'm gonna pray and follow God until He gets me there. But there are some practical ways that if you are there, I'd like you to talk about. You talk about job crafting, so kind of adding some tweaks to make it meaningful. And it made me remember back. I don't. I think this is true, but JFK was touring NASA, saw a janitor, walked over and said, "Hey, what do you do here?" And the janitor's answer was, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." So whatever you're doing, try to find a purpose in it, and then learn how to serve others at work. Maybe that's your purpose. Maybe not necessarily the job itself, but who you're interacting with,
Yeah,
and then
right on.
build positive relationships. So I think there are ways, but I'd love to get your go deeper dive on, thinking about a dad he's making ends meet, doesn't feel like he has a whole lot of choice to do something different than he's got, right now on the plate. Within that, how do you find that meaning and purpose?
Mm,
Yeah, and this is a core topic that I investigated in my prior book, The HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose, as well as in the new book, Good Money. I am firmly of the belief that almost any job can be meaningful. And I think one of the fundamental misconceptions that we have is that we are finding purposeful work or finding a way to be purposeful rather than creating that ourselves. And I want to restore agency to people, which is you actually are in control of the purpose that you create in your professional environment, at least to some extent. Now, some jobs may be more inherently meaningful than others, but if you look at the surveys, there are as many dissatisfied teachers as investment bankers, right? You can be
Mm,
in a job that seems intrinsically meaningful, but you don't get meaning from it. And so I really encourage people to change their mindset and focus on that a lot. One of the great stories I told in the prior book was this bus driver in Dallas, Curtis Jenkins, who actually ended up viral on national news. And, school bus driver can be a pretty thankless task. I think it would be one of those jobs that you described as like, man, I got to do this to make ends meet, but it's not my calling. This guy was phenomenal because he viewed his job as the first adult that a kid met outside of their home every day at school and the last adult they saw before they went home. And he didn't know what their school environment was like. He didn't know what their home environment
nice.
was like.
Yeah.
That he wanted to be a positive influence on those kids in the 2 times he was their caretaker. So the job of, like, picking people up at point A and dropping them at point B was almost not really a part of his mindset at all. He did that well.
mm,
It was, "How can I create what he called a yellow bus utopia, when they're on the bus with me?" And he would give them compliments as they walked in. He assigned roles to the kids. He'd make one, the president, another a police officer, and, like, every kid felt really known. And he became effectively really a counselor and a caretaker to these kids more than a bus driver. And
wow.
that's within the power of anyone in any job. We've all met cashiers who we encounter and they lift our
Yeah.
spirits the way they treat us when we go through that line. So the 4 simple tips I offer, you touched on them. One is this idea of job crafting, which is exactly what I described with Curtis. Take the job you have and make it the job you want. If your job is bus driver, rethink it and make your job caretaker for kids and adapt the way in which you do that job to be more meaningful. There was actually a study of hospital janitors that was one of the initial research projects on this. And the ones that were happy viewed themselves as part of the care team. They were sending a man to the moon. One of them would switch around the artwork on the walls of long term patients so that they could see something beautiful throughout their stay.
Oh,
Was
Wow.
experimenting with cleaning fluids. This is within the power of anyone in that job, and yet
Yes.
only a small percentage of people were doing it. And so I think job crafting is really important. I think treating work as a craft is the second principle. This idea of craftsmanship, we get real purpose from a job well done, right? We see this often with like the old carpenters and people who made shoes, et cetera, that they would just perfect their craft. The Japanese are actually notorious for this. Well, they'll spend years perfecting a craft. most of us don't look at an element of our job or different elements with our job as an as an opportunity for perfection of that craft, refining
Mm.
it. And yet, just the act of treating it as a craft instead of a task can give us greater meaning. And then the other two components, the first is building positive relationships at work. Too many people are in work environments where they don't build friendships, where they don't cultivate positive relationships, or worse, they're in negative relationships. And yet, relationships in almost every survey are the most important determinant of human happiness, the depth and breadth of our positive relationships. And so we can't neglect those at work. And then the final one is to connect your work to service, which is to look at every interaction you have as an opportunity to serve others. Again, in the surveys, generosity and service are one of the two or three components of greatest happiness in life. And so if you start to view your colleagues, your clients, the vendors and partners that you work with as people that you can take an attitude of service towards,
Yeah.
not only does it build your relationships, but it gives you more of an inherent sense of meaning and purpose in the work that you do.
So John, let me try to internalize this in real time, and you tell me how close I am to being on target.
Here we go.
If I stopped looking at my job as having to put up with Lawson on the
Knew
podcast,
it.
but instead, I saw my role as keep him
You're
out of
here to
Audrey's
serve me.
hair. I keep him out of Audrey's hair for an hour. All of a sudden, doing this podcast could take on more meaning if I'm interpreting your ideas correctly.
No, all I heard was that you were supposed to be serving me.
Oh, yeah. Here's what I
Lawson
heard.
picked up the opposite piece of
Yeah.
direction from this.
Yeah, exactly. It's like he's
Ken should
listening
be
through a
serving me a
reverse
lot
mirror. Yeah, Lawson
Yeah.
looks at life through the mirror. He sees everything backward. So John, okay, you've been alive long enough to have lived two lives, I'll call it. The life before you had children and the life since you've had children. Your oldest is 12, so you had children roughly 12 years ago. How has your perspective on money changed, or has it changed since you started having your kids of your own?
Yeah, gosh, I am of the view that almost everything changes when you have kids. I think your understanding of God changes a lot.
Mhm.
The first time you're sitting in a seat of unconditional love, I think, in the way that, in a rough version of the way that God feels it for us.
Yeah.
Uh, it's your first exposure to people who you want nothing more than success for, and they're constantly thinking that you're trying to ruin their lives. Kind of like you think about God. And then in the practical realities, I think any parent suddenly feels this heightened sense of responsibility for the financial well-being of their kids. And especially having come up from an environment where early in my life, we didn't have very much money at all. I almost grew up with a fear-based mindset around money where
Yeah.
I was afraid of not having enough. And that's something
Okay.
I've carried forward. And I've had to deal with that a lot now because we have more resources than we need now for the kids. And yet I still embrace this where I feel like we're constantly on the precipice of not providing them the life that they need. And I can fall prey to this temptation to overwork, to spend more time on my professional career than I need to obsess about it, to worry about that next incremental dollar, even at the expense of spending real quality time with them. And so what I'm trying to embrace now is certainly I want to be a responsible parent. I want my kids to have a better life than I had. I think every parent wants that. I'm having to temper that by realizing that now that my kids have more than they need, even if I had less than I needed at certain points, I need to make sure they don't grow up with bad habits that come with having excess resources. My wife and I talk about that all the time. I had a mentor one time who said his best advice, financial advice for parents with kids is keep them poor. Like, don't let them grow up
Right.
too much. Teach them to earn it, just like you learned to earn it. Um, and at the same time, also making the time to model the right behaviors across work, across faith, across spending, across giving, such that kids grow up with a really balanced attitude towards money itself.
Mhm.
They're in a position then not to be corrupted by wealth, not to live in fear if they don't have it, but really to be both prudent and faithful in the way that they steward it.
I love that.
Well said.
Let me quote a Bible verse to you, and then I just want you to react to it. It's one you've probably quoted yourself a lot, because as you were describing earlier, that idea of if I make X, I just need X plus, and that X just keeps moving. And for the astute listener, you use the word hedonic a couple times, which we would all know as the root word. The word of that is the word hedonism, right? No surprise that there's a war between our spirit and our flesh. That's not a shocker for the Christian audience. I love the verse. What the verse you made me think of was Philippians 4, when Paul's describing, and he says, I'm not saying this because I'm in need. I've learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. And Paul goes on to say, in verse 12, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. You just alluded to that, John. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether being well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. What have you learned about contentment as you have explored this topic of money at such great depth?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as Christians, we're told not that we'll necessarily become prosperous or constantly live in comfort. That's not the promise of Christianity. The promise is that we have hope in life everlasting and in the sacrifices of Jesus. And that if we follow that, we'll have a contentment of spirit. And so I think there's an important lesson there for those of us in all circumstances, whether you're in prison, whether you don't have enough, whether you have too much. As a practical reality, I don't think the Bible necessarily is condemning of money itself. And what I want to say about that is God often throughout the Bible blessed different individuals with money. Didn't bless everyone with money, even his most faithful followers. Paul would be an example throughout his life, or Peter. But he did bless some. Abraham was one of the wealthiest people of his day. David was, even some New Testament figures. And I'm of the view that money can be a tool that God blesses you with, just like talent, just like spiritual discernment, almost like anything. But your purpose is to steward that for His purposes rather than your own, and that's the key to unlocking it. And he does warn that there's a unique temptation to money. Money is mentioned something like 2,350 times in the Bible. And there are a lot of warnings about it, just like a few other topics, like money. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for example, which is prioritizing money over more important things. And so I think do need spiritually to learn a sense of contentment and then to connect that to our practical day to day lives. I don't think God commands us to live in squalor. I think parents are right to try and provide a good education, a good home, shelter, and food for their kids. The question is, do you do that to excess in a way that really flaunts those resources, or do you do that with moderation and prudence? The mainstream research kind of backs this up. So there was a very famous study by two Nobel Prize winners called Angus Deaton and Daniel Kahneman about a decade ago, where they found that even in happiness research, anything beyond $75,000 at the time, about $110,000 today or $105,000 today, led to less incremental happiness. So that once you achieve meeting your basic financial needs, even though we think more money will make us happy, if you measure it, it really doesn't. And so people have disputed that precise number, but almost indisputable throughout the research is that after a certain point, material possessions are not a source of happiness and fulfillment in our
Mm.
life, right? But most people really lose sight of that, and we spend on the wrong things, thinking material things rather than things like experiences or health will make us happy. We work to accumulate resources without being generous with others, and so we accumulate that wealth, but we don't end up using it in a way that our faith or even the basic principles of psychology would tell us is most rewarding for us and those around us.
Hmm. John, how do you talk to your kids about using money for a purpose? On our show, we talk a lot and we say, you're not a father on accident, so go be a father on purpose.
Yeah.
When you're talking to your kids as they're learning, maybe it's an allowance, maybe it's their first job, maybe they're in college and get ready to actually make a salary or something like that. How do you talk to them about finding purpose for their money?
Yes. We picked up, this is the area I learned the most in researching this book. I had a chance to talk to a lot of healthy, well adjusted, wealthy families, some mentors who are good in this area. Um, and I think it starts with the basic practice of just introducing them to money. So we use a ledger system. Some people have like a give, save, spend kind of
Yeah.
bucket system or online system. We use a ledger where we actually write down the money that they get for chores, et cetera. And then we write it out when they spend money that we charge against it. They have an opportunity to give and to invest every year. And I can get into greater detail on that. And that's for our 5-year-old through our 12-year-old. They all have their individual ledger
Right
and they're
on.
keeping money that they have. Then for each of those buckets, we're trying to apprentice them and model the right behaviors in a way that's age appropriate. For my 5-year-old, it's different than my 12-year-old. So for spending, we try and first model, like one of the principles we teach our kids is we're happy to buy you stuff that helps you achieve more in the area you want, like decent basketball shoes, like camp experiences, etc. But we're going to prioritize experiences, not stuff, because stuff won't make you happy. And we won't ever let you buy something because someone else has it. Like if you're wanting to buy a Stanley Cup or a nice pair of shoes because your friends have them and you want to keep pace, totally out. Like we were going to ban it. You're going to
Wrong
get
motive. Wrong
something
motive.
different. Motive. Because you don't want to spend to keep up with people, and spending on
Wow.
stuff is the worst way you can spend. So we prioritize experiences, mental, physical, and spiritual health, relationships that you can have together, those sorts of things that drive greater happiness. On the giving side, one of the practices we've embraced really formally for the first time this last year is beginning to give as a family. We had really sheltered our kids from our own giving
Hmm.
because the numbers look wonky to a small kid based
Yeah.
on what we're giving. We don't give them a sense for exactly how much we're giving, but we had a family meeting this year and we told each kid, we're going to give you $250 to give to a charity of your choice. And then out of your ledger, whatever you choose to give, we'll 10x that gift to the charity of your choice. And we give them a list of 5 charities that they could support. And what was crazy to me, the kids loved it. Like the first one we went to was my 12-year-old, and one of the charities was a medical charity for a condition that my daughter suffers, actually. Most of them were Christian charities. This was a non Christian charity. And my 12-year-old comes to him and he says, I'm going to give my 250 to the medical charity that treats our daughter's condition. And then I'm going to just give all the money in my ledger to that too. And
Wow.
we went through and all 3 of the kids wanted
Love that.
entire ledger to charity. And we actually had to cap it. We said, no, we need ledgers to teach you some other lessons. We'll top up your giving a little bit to make sure, like, you guys are awesome. We capped them at like 30%.
Wow.
But it was like such a convicting moment of generosity for my wife and I, because the kids thought nothing about giving way more than they needed to
Hmm.
support others. And it was just something as a family that really bonded us and allowed us to talk about generosity. And then even on the giving side, so they all experience savings, and then we pay 20% to the kids for the savings they have at the end of the year in their ledger is like the bank of mom and dad for rudimentary investments. And then for my oldest, we've actually started a discretionary account with a different pool of money. My financial advisor is his financial advisor, and they now have independent meetings about how to manage that portfolio without me present. And so as the kids get older, we're trying to get them just much more deeply ingrained in what these practices look like.
Mm.
Years ago, John, the largest gift we had gotten at our ministry to date was from an individual. He had sold a business. His name's Jeff, and he gave us what at the time was a ton of money for one time. And so later I asked him, I said, hey, like, I didn't even know you had some money. Like, can I be real? And he goes, yeah, he said, we sold a business, and we ended up wanting to give more to fewer organizations. So we just chose that. It was our model. He goes, so we gave you guys a check and gave so-and-so a check. He goes, and then we gave our kids some money from the business sale and wanted them to give it away to their favorite charities too. And we're sitting at lunch and he goes, and don't call my kids and ask for their money too. Which was fantastic. And he knows me pretty well. I don't normally miss an opportunity to ask someone to give. So I was like, no, your kids are safe. Your kids are safe. But as a parent, to be modeling generosity and saying, look, man, we kind of crossed over this line of our basic needs, sort of some time ago, and we're kind of checking some boxes financially. Have you found any challenges in that regard? What have you observed? If a dad listens to today's show, let me do this and then we'll kind of wrap up. If a dad listens to today's show and is in that position, and it may not be thousands and thousands of dollars, it may be dozens of dollars, it may be just an allowance, but he wants to encourage generosity, or he wants to encourage at least this more dynamic view of how money can be used in ways that benefit God's kingdom. What are some simple starting points for him? Is it like a ledger system or an envelope system? What would you tell to the dad who says, man, John, great point. We're not like rolling in it, but we're also not living hand to mouth either. How can he get started doing this in a simple way?
Totally. Yeah. And the ledger system works whether you're giving the kids $2 a week or $30 a week or $100 a week, right? And ours we keep modest. We want to keep them poor, as I mentioned before. They're not quite poor, but we don't want them to have too much because we're not sure that they would manage that responsibly at this point. I think the ledger system has worked for us. There are some online platforms like Greenlight and others where you can do this now if you prefer online. We keep a physical ledger just because it feels more tangible. Some people use jars. The method is not as important as just teaching the basics of earning, giving, spending, and investing that money. With generosity, if I highlighted one thing that I thought helped wealthy families be the most functional versus the least functional, it's this habit of family generosity. So having giving meetings together, really thinking about how they're stewarding resources for generosity together. Almost every well-adjusted wealthy family I know does that. They have a practice of formally sitting down and doing that together. And that we preach to the kids a couple of things, and this is part of the advice in the book. We want you to be a percentage giver. So not think about giving the excess of what you have, but the first fruits of what you have. And you can give excess beyond that. Like the 10% tithe number in the Christian faith is actually a fiction that comes out of something else. God never says 10% is the right number. He says he wants you to give kind of the first fruits of what you do. And so we teach them like first you want to carve out some for giving, and then everything else has to fit within what's left. That may be 5% for some people, it may be 50% for some people, but we want them to become percentage givers. We want them to develop a passion for what they're giving to. So we pre-selected some charities just so they didn't go wonky. They are kids. We could end up with some pretty wild charities if we let them choose from anything.
Sure,
We
sure.
pre-selected some that we thought would align with their interests, but we wanted to be something they feel really strongly about. We want them to participate in those. And so we really think it's important not just to give financially, but then to do service for those organizations. Like I took my son on his first mission trip a couple of years ago. That was a huge moment for him. We encourage him to volunteer at different charities, whether those be hunger charities, et cetera, just so they're getting a real world connection to where that money is going, and to partner with others, right? Which is why we give in community. And the Bible is clear: we shouldn't give to get recognition. We shouldn't stand up on a rooftop, but I do think giving in partnership with those you're close to has a real role in generosity because you learn from each other, you develop a
Yeah,
relationship.
me too.
And that's not showing off your giving. That's actually modeling it for one another and holding one another accountable, which I think is sometimes forgotten in
Smart.
our people of faith.
Yeah, I love that. John, last question for me, and I've really enjoyed this, man. Thanks a lot for
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
thank you.
joining us on the show, and I'm enjoying your book. I'm gonna keep learning. Um, but kind of wrap us up with the thought of us being not owners but stewards, and
Mm,
so releasing control, sort of like it, what comes to us is from God, and we can hear Him direct us for where it can go from us, and this overflowing. And how do you talk to your kids about, living with this sense of knowing that God provides? He provides what we need. He provides enough for us to do for others, and really cementing that in our kids as they're growing up young and moving on into, their own adult life.
that's great.
Yeah, this is such a delicate topic, right? In a couple of different directions, because we do want the kids to know God is giving you all you need in your life. Now, that might not be prosperity, it might be suffering, it might be something else, but in the eternal perspective, He's given us what we need. And He has also promised that He'll never give us more than He can bear, right? That He'll be with us through those trials. And so that we try and disconnect a bit from just material circumstances because we don't want them to think if they ever go through a difficult financial time that God has abandoned them, or if they're at a difficult professional moment, but that they can pray and that God will give them discernment and wisdom about the path forward. And this idea of stewardship for me, any gift that God gives you is a blessing from Him and something that we should learn to steward for His purposes, whether that's your job and the influence or power you have through your job. Like I get to be the CEO of a company. To me, that's a responsibility as much as a privilege, which is given that point of responsibility, I am responsible for helping to create flourishing in the lives of the people who work with me,
Right.
hopefully show the gospel to them in the work that I do, whether I'm in a secular or a Christian environment, and to really take seriously that gift that God's given me of responsibility and all that comes with it. And that could be true of other talents, art, if you're artistic, if you're musical, if you have wealth. And the idea is that this is not mine. I didn't earn it. I didn't earn it. This has been given to me. Um, Without falling into the trap of being passive. And this is where Christians sometimes go the other direction, which is like, okay, I'm just going to rely on God. I'll pray about it and see what happens. I think God wants you to run the race as if to win it, to work with excellence. The parable of the talents would tell us if he gives us something, he wants to magnify it 5 or 10-fold, not to bring it back to him just the way he gave it. So we do also have a responsibility to grow, to perform with excellence, to be the best that we can be. But doing so with the right mindset and the right purpose for that, even if our intent, like if we're given wealth, I think the Bible says we're supposed to steward that wealth to grow it, so long as we're then using it in a way that's really aligned with what he would command us to do. And so I know I rambled all over the place. There are a
No, that was
couple of
great. Yeah, I agree.
topics there, but Christians can fall into different traps, I think, on both sides
Yeah.
of that. And it is a discernment that you have to take to walk it properly.
Man, I remember, John, one time asking a friend of mine who was one of the wealthiest guys I personally know. And I just said, "Hey, what do you attribute your success to?" And he said, "Well, I can't get up in the morning and take one breath without God putting air in my lungs. So there's
Mm.
that." Like that, and that was just his starting point. And then interestingly, he goes, "And secondly, God gave me a high tolerance for risk." Like that's
Mhm.
his two things were God puts air in my lungs and he gave me a high tolerance for risk. Like literally, that's where this guy started. Now, he could have started 40 other places. Well, I got a good
Mhm.
degree. I'm really smart. I read a lot of books. All that was true. But
Yeah.
to your point, he had struck the balance between, yes, God is the provider, but I also work pretty intentionally and just brilliant because you just summarized it so well. Hey, Dad, listening today, you've been listening to John Coleman. Go get his new book, Good Money: 6 Steps to Building a Financial Life with Purpose. And you might notice the last word of his subtitle is the word purpose. Go get his book because you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. John, thank you so much for joining us today, brother. Greatly appreciate the conversation.
Ken, Lawson, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.